The Lost Gospel of Jesus' Brother, a rare book dealer's quest for the hidden manuscript that could rewrite history. I remember the exact moment I first heard about the rumored incomplete gospel. I was seated in my cramped antiquarian bookshop in New York. Soft evening light filtered through my front window, illuminating the motes of dust that danced above shelves crammed full of old volumes. Business had been slow all week, and I'd taken to leafing through a new auction catalogue from Swan Galleries. The phone rattled my desk. I figured it would be another client asking about a first edition Hemingway or a Victorian children's book. Instead, a crisp voice with a hint of a Californian lilt introduced himself as Martin Kwan. An emissary, he said, of Mr. Conrad Dunham. I instantly recognized the name. Dunham was a Silicon Valley magnate with a reputation for eccentricity. He had made a fortune in microchip manufacturing before turning to philanthropic art and manuscript collecting. He was known to pay astronomical sums for unique items. Now his interest had shifted to early Christian manuscripts. Mr. Dunham needs help finding a very particular text, Kwan said. He's aware that you specialize in rare religious manuscripts. Would you be willing to meet? I cleared my throat, trying not to sound too eager. Of course, I'll rearrange my schedule. When and where? Tomorrow, 9 a.m., the Lowell Hotel's penthouse suite. I hung up, heart pounding slightly. The Lowell was an opulent Madison Avenue hotel. Clearly, Dunham was not one to haggle over day rates. I spent the remainder of the evening paging through my reference volumes on early Christian texts. The name Nag Hammadi kept leaping to mind. Those mid-20th century discoveries, 13 codices unearthed in Egypt containing Gnostic and early Christian writings, had long fascinated me. Much had been published and studied, yet rumors had persisted for decades of additional fragments hidden away or lost. I recalled one obscure footnote in a journal article about a nearly finished gospel that was never recovered. Could Dunham be after that? The next morning, I walked into the Lowell's lobby with my leather folio under my arm. The doorman guided me to the private elevator, and I emerged into a lush suite where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a tranquil Manhattan. There, standing by a large oak desk, was Conrad Dunham himself. He was younger than I expected, mid-50s perhaps, sporting well-tailored casual attire and the composed demeanor of someone used to getting what he wanted. Next to him was Martin Kwan, a slender man with glasses and a subtle smile. Dunham extended his hand. I've read your articles on Coptic manuscripts, and I know you've sourced rare Gnostic texts for private collectors in the past. Let's get down to business. He gestured to a comfortable armchair. I'm looking for something that might not even exist, but if it does, it is the ultimate find. A nearly finished gospel from the early Christian era, purportedly part of the Nag Hammadi cache, never catalogued with the rest. It's said to be a draft, a manuscript that reveals an altogether different perspective on Jesus' teachings. I want you to find it. I attempted to steady my voice. You're speaking of the rumored incomplete codex. Some say it was buried by monks but never recovered alongside the others found in 1945. Dunham nodded. Exactly. I've received word from a Coptic specialist in Cairo, a contact in Paris, and an Oxford theologian. Each independently hinted that this gospel was more than a legend. I'm prepared to fund a comprehensive hunt. Money, travel, research support, whatever you need. This was a dream opportunity. I must warn you, I said, such a search might lead nowhere. Even if the text existed once, it could have disintegrated by now, or sit in a private collection hidden from scholars. Dunham smiled, looking oddly serene. That's why I hired you. I trust your discretion and perseverance. Bring me the codex, and I will make it worth your while. I nodded, and we spent an hour discussing logistics. Dunham gave me a generous retainer. As I left, my mind was racing. I had leads, old colleagues at the British Library, a friend of a friend who once worked on the facsimiles of the Nag Hammadi codices, and a Jesuit scholar in Rome who had whispered about fragments that never saw daylight. This would be no simple eBay hunt. This would take me across continents. My first stop was London. I managed a brief appointment with Dr. Fiona Blanchard at the British Library. She was a papyrologist who had handled some of the oldest fragments of early Christian texts. In her cosy office hidden amid labyrinthine corridors, She sipped Earl Grey and eyed me inquisitively over her teacups. "I heard you're on the Dunham payroll now," she said, half joking. "He's famously persistent." I gave a small nod, chuckling. "I need to confirm something. Have you come across any references, even oblique, to an incomplete codex believed to be part of the Nag Hammadi set?" She pursed her lips, set down her tea. "Ah, that old rumor. You know, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts were discovered in 1945 by local Egyptians near the town of Nag Hammadi. 13 leather-bound papyrus codices containing 52 mostly Gnostic treatises, including the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and others. The collection revolutionized our understanding of early Christianity, but from the start, there were whispers of a 14th codex." I leaned forward. "A 14th codex? I've heard something about an unfinished gospel. Was there any record?" She walked over to a file cabinet and retrieved a photocopy of a decades-old article from the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. "There's a footnote here by a certain Dr. Hans Belzoni, a scholar in the 1950s, who suggested that local monks, fearing Roman or Orthodox Church reprisals, buried not just 13 codices, but also fragments of a final, not quite complete gospel. Belzoni never found it. He died before he could verify. Some say the pages were scattered by antiquities dealers in Cairo's souks in the early 20th century. I glanced at the footnote. It mentioned that Belzoni corresponded with a Coptic priest, Father Maron, stationed in a small monastery near Sohag, not far from the original find site. "Would the monastery still exist?" She shrugged. "Most likely, yes. The White Monastery near Sohag is ancient. If any oral tradition remains, it might be there, or perhaps in the Cairo Antiquities market records at the Egyptian Museum. But be careful. The illicit trade in manuscripts is tricky. Also, some Gnostic texts were considered heretical and dangerous. Those who hold them might not welcome your curiosity." I thanked her and took my leave. As I walked out into the London drizzle, I decided Cairo would be my next stop. Cairo's streets always made me feel like I'd stepped into another era. Donkey carts and luxury cars shared the roads. Ancient minarets overlooked modern apartment blocks. I booked myself into a modest hotel in downtown Cairo and arranged a meeting with a local Coptic scholar named Youssef Khalil, who worked part-time as a consultant for the Egyptian Museum. We met in a small cafe in Khan el-Khalili, the centuries-old bazaar district. The scent of cardamom coffee and grilling meats filled the air. Youssef was in his 60s, a gentleman with silver-framed glasses. Over a tiny cup of Arabic coffee, I explained my quest. "Ah, the rumoured incomplete gospel," he said softly, smiling. "I've heard it called the Codex of the Half-Light. Just a nickname. The story goes that an unnamed scribe began copying a new gospel, something that blended Jesus' words with a more mystical Gnostic undertone. The work was never finished, and for some reason the monks buried it with the others, but it got separated at some point." He paused. "You must know, these manuscripts often changed hands through the black market. There was a time in the early 20th century when fragments from Nag Hammadi were sold piecemeal to art dealers in Cairo and Luxor." I leaned closer. "Any chance some record of such a fragment exists in old sales ledgers or dealer archives?" Youssef thought a moment. "There was a dealer, long deceased, named Nakil. He was known to have sold fragments of papyri to Western collectors in the 1920s and 30s. Some of his ledgers were donated to the library at the American University in Cairo. If anyone recorded a strange partial gospel, it might be in there." The next day, I visited the AUC Library's special collections. After a bit of bureaucratic tango, I got permission to review Nakil's ledgers. They were dusty tomes, written in a mix of Arabic and French. After hours of searching, I found a curious entry dated 1927. Sold 3 leaves of unknown Coptic gospel fragment to Monsieur Delacroix of Paris, described as incomplete gospel similar to Nag Hammadi texts. Buyer very enthusiastic. This was a breakthrough. 3 leaves of the incomplete gospel had made it to Paris in the 1920s. If I could track these fragments down, perhaps I could confirm the text's authenticity. I flew to Paris feeling a surge of excitement. I had a name: Monsieur Delacroix. Unfortunately, Delacroix was a common name in France. My inquiries led me from one archive to another. Eventually, a reference librarian at the Bibliothèque Nationale traced a certain antiquities collector, Jean-Michel Delacroix, active in the 1920s. Delacroix had died childless, and his estate was sold in bits and pieces. Some items went to the Louvre, some to private collectors, and some disappeared. With some persistence, I located a distant relative in Marseille who remembered family lore that Delacroix had donated certain religious manuscripts to the Church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris. I arranged a meeting with Father Pierre at Saint-Sulpice, a scholarly priest who oversaw the church's small manuscript collection. We met under the hushed arches of the church's library, the smell of old leather bindings and incense lingering. Father Pierre wore a simple cassock and rimless glasses. Monsieur Delacroix did indeed donate some manuscripts in the 1930s, he said, pulling out a register. Let's see. Yes, here. Fragments of a Coptic text, possibly Gnostic, 3 leaves in poor condition. We do have them. I could hardly contain my excitement. The priest laid out a protective cloth on a wooden table and produced a small archival box. Inside were 3 brittle papyrus leaves, with faint Coptic script in a Sahidic dialect. The script was neat but unfinished in places. The text mentioned hidden words spoken by the living Jesus and referred to the kingdom within, themes reminiscent of the Gospel of Thomas, but it also spoke of the veil of illusion and the twin of the Lord, references that sounded more explicitly Gnostic. "What do you think?" asked Father Pierre, watching me carefully. I explained my theory. These leaves could be part of the rumoured incomplete gospel from the lost codex. If so, the rest might still be out there. He nodded gravely and allowed me to take high-resolution photographs. He'd need church permission to sell or lend these fragments, but I told him I was primarily interested in identification at this point. As I left Saint-Sulpice, I wondered where the rest of the codex could be. Perhaps these 3 leaves were split off from the main body decades ago. Time to check another lead. The White Monastery near Sohag in Egypt, the one mentioned in Belzoni's footnote. Back in Egypt, I travelled by train along the Nile Valley, dust swirling outside my window, date palms passing in slow procession. The White Monastery, officially the Monastery of St. Shenouda, was a fortress-like structure of ancient stone, not far from the city of Sohag. Inside, I met with a kindly monk named Brother Matthias, who oversaw the monastery's small museum of Coptic manuscripts. Matthias, with a flowing grey beard and kind eyes, listened patiently as I recounted my quest. To my surprise, he nodded knowingly. "We have an oral tradition here," he said in measured English. "It speaks of a codex that our ancestors tried to protect, a gospel that was considered dangerous because it portrayed the teachings of Jesus in a way that challenged certain orthodox views. The story says that a scribe began copying it secretly. He wrote it in Coptic, but included commentaries in the margins that aligned more with Gnostic thought, the idea that salvation comes from self-knowledge and inner enlightenment, not just faith in the institutional church." My heart hammered. "Do you have any record of where it might have ended up?" "Only a parable that it was hidden twice, once before the main Nag Hammadi discovery, and once more after a piece of it was stolen. Our archives mention a travelling manuscript dealer who out of fear sold fragments to a European collector, but kept the main codex hidden. They say he eventually took it south." "South? Into Sudan?" I asked, surprised. Matthias nodded. "It's not well documented, but some monks fled persecution by travelling up the Nile. Our legends say the codex travelled far. If it survived, maybe it ended in some private collection, or a remote monastery storeroom." This was an unexpected turn. Searching along the Nile corridor was daunting, but I had money and resources. I decided to return to Cairo and contact Dunham with an update. Maybe his network could help track leads in Sudan or elsewhere. Dunham's video call came through late at night Cairo time. He appeared calm, listening intently to my story about the St. Sulpice fragments and the White Monastery legend. I explained the possibility that the main codex had travelled south. "Fascinating," said Dunham. "I have a contact at the Nubian Museum in Aswan. Speak to Dr. Hannah Ibrahim. She's an expert on manuscript movements along the Nile. I'll arrange an introduction. Keep going. I trust you." I took a domestic flight to Aswan. Then a short taxi ride brought me to the Nubian Museum, a modern, beautifully arranged institution celebrating the region's heritage. Dr. Ibrahim was a tall, poised woman in her 40s with a warm smile. She greeted me in her office, decorated with maps and photographs of archaeological digs. I explained what I was after. She closed her eyes, thinking. There's a record from the 19th century of a cache of Coptic and Christian Arabic manuscripts that surfaced near the old trading town of Wadi Halfa, just over the Sudanese border. Some European adventurers mentioned encountering monks who guarded mysterious texts, but no one confirmed their fate. I sighed. Another vague clue. Dr. Ibrahim took pity on me. I recently read about a private Swiss collector who claims to have unpublished fragments of early Christian texts. His name is Arnaud Vollen, based in Geneva. He's notoriously secretive, and rumor has it he deals quietly with stolen antiquities. If the codex moved through the black market, he might have it, or know who does. Dunham's money and influence soon secured me a meeting with Vollen. I flew to Geneva, the crisp alpine air a sharp contrast to Egypt's warmth. Vollen's residence was a modernist glass and steel structure overlooking Lake Geneva. Inside, the decor was minimalist, but I spotted telltale signs of a wealthy collector, a Byzantine icon here, a fragment of Egyptian papyrus framed over there. Vollen greeted me in fluent English. He was slender, wore a tailored suit, and had pale eyes that never seemed to blink enough. I laid my cards on the table, explaining that I represented a serious collector. He feigned ignorance at first, but when I mentioned a nearly finished gospel from Nag Hammadi provenance, I saw a flicker of recognition. "You are persistent," he said with a tight smile. "Such a codex would be priceless. Why do you think I know of it?" "Because every trail leads to dead ends, and you're known for having pieces others think are lost," I said. "I can pay for information." He watched me carefully, then stood and led me down a hallway. We entered a temperature-controlled room lined with shelves of protective boxes. From one box he withdrew a single papyrus leaf sealed in a mylar sleeve. He held it up. I saw Coptic script, similar to the Saint Sulpice fragments. "This leaf," said Vollen, "I acquired through a complicated chain of intermediaries. It's said to be part of a codex once hidden near Nag Hammadi. I do not have the entire codex, merely this leaf. The rest, so I was told, remains in a private monastic library in the borderlands between Egypt and Sudan. The monks there are extremely secretive. I never reached them. The last dealer who tried returned empty-handed, terrified." I swallowed. "Terrified? Why?" He shrugged. "Perhaps the text is guarded by those who do not wish its contents known. Perhaps it's cursed. Who can say?" He paused. "I'll sell you this single leaf for a substantial sum. Or I can give you the location of this monastery's rumored coordinates for a lesser fee, just enough to cover my costs." I called Dunham. He told me to pay whatever it took to get the location. After a brief negotiation, Vollen handed me a piece of paper with coordinates and the monastery's rumored name, Deir al-Bakarat, the Monastery of the Cows, so called because of carvings on nearby cliffs. Armed with this cryptic clue, I returned to Egypt and arranged a journey south. I hired a guide, a wiry Nubian named Ahmed who spoke some local dialects and knew the desert tracks. After 2 days of travel by jeep and a short ferry crossing over the Nile, we approached a remote valley. It was scorching hot, the sun relentless. Eventually, we spotted a weathered structure built into rock cliffs, partially hidden by a bend in the valley, Deir al-Bakarat. We approached cautiously. The monastery was ancient, with a small garden and a few huts. At first, we saw no one. Then a robed figure emerged, a tall, gaunt monk with a lined face and intense eyes. He said nothing as I approached, only watched. I introduced myself in halting Arabic, explaining I sought ancient Coptic manuscripts. The monk's eyes narrowed. Days passed. I slept in a guest hut outside the monastery walls. The monks allowed me inside only at prayer times, which were austere and silent. I tried to build trust. I helped draw water, offered some of my supplies. Slowly they warmed to me. One evening, the gaunt monk, Brother Samuel, I learned, came to my hut with another monk who spoke some English. "Why do you seek the gospel?" asked the translator. His eyes were wary. "Many have come wanting it. No one leaves with it." I took a deep breath. "I am charged with preserving and understanding it. I believe it's important historically and spiritually. I don't come to exploit it. I want to see it safe, studied by scholars who appreciate its value." The monks exchanged glances. Finally, Brother Samuel nodded. "We have it," said the translator. "But you must know, it contradicts much that is accepted. Its words are dangerous. We fear persecution. We fear misunderstanding." I pressed gently. The Church once suppressed Gnostic texts, but now scholars approach them with respect. The world might be ready. After a tense silence, they agreed to show me the codex the following morning. I barely slept. At dawn, in a cool, torch-lit chamber carved into the rock, they brought out a wooden chest. Inside, wrapped in linen, was a codex, its leather cover brittle, its papyrus pages delicate. As I carefully turned the pages, I recognized the same handwriting style and Coptic script as in the fragments I'd seen. Unlike the others, this codex ended abruptly, mid-sentence. Truly, it was incomplete. The text combined parables, sayings of Jesus, and commentary that resembled Valentinian Gnostic theology. It spoke of the spark of the divine within each person, and of Jesus as a revealer of hidden knowledge, not just a savior through crucifixion. Then I found something else. Marginal notes by the scribe, lamenting that time and fear prevented the full completion. The scribe noted that certain teachings, like Jesus' emphasis on self-knowledge to attain unity with the divine, would be deemed heretical by the emerging Orthodox Church. He feared that if the Church found this text, it would be destroyed. One line stuck out. The Master said, "What you do not find within, you will never find without. The kingdom is within you, and you are within the kingdom. Be not led astray by those who speak only of obedience and sacrifice. The true offering is understanding." I realized the theological implications. This portrayed Jesus as more of a spiritual guide initiating disciples into mystic understanding, rather than the unique Son of God who redeems through suffering and resurrection. It leaned heavily toward a Gnostic vision where salvation is enlightenment. For Orthodox believers, this could be groundbreaking or devastating. The monks watched me read in silence. I asked them why they kept it hidden for so long. Brother Samuel, through the translator, replied, "Because our forefathers feared persecution, but also we were waiting for someone who sought truth more than profit." I felt ashamed. I had been hired by a billionaire who wanted a trophy, but as I held the codex, I knew it was more than a collectible. It was a key to understanding the diversity of early Christianity. "Let me photograph it and secure its study by honest scholars," I said. "Your monastery can remain its guardian. I will not force it from you." They seemed surprised. "You do not want to take it?" asked the translator, incredulous. I shook my head. "If I do, it might end up locked in a private vault, its meaning lost. Better to have the world learn of it through scholarly publication, done with the monastery's consent and cooperation." A long silence followed. Then Brother Samuel placed a hand on my shoulder. "We will allow this under conditions. You must ensure it is studied by those who respect it, and we must remain anonymous." I agreed. I spent the next days carefully photographing every page. I took meticulous notes. The monks looked relieved, as if a great burden had been shared. I returned to Cairo and contacted Dunham. He was ecstatic, expecting me to bring him the codex. I explained it would stay where it was. I would provide him with complete digital facsimiles and help arrange for a team of reputable scholars, Coptologists, theologians, historians, to study it on site at the monastery, with the monks' permission. Dunham was disappointed. He'd wanted the physical object, but he was a businessman. He understood leverage. "You're asking me to fund a research expedition to the middle of nowhere and settle for digital images," he said on a call. I stood my ground. "You wanted to find it. We did. It exists, and I can give you exclusive early access to its contents. This text could rewrite a chapter of religious history, and you can be credited for making that discovery possible." He sighed, then agreed. Perhaps he realized that owning the discovery's narrative might be just as valuable as owning the object itself. Months passed. A quiet team of scholars went to the monastery and confirmed the codex's authenticity. It was carbon-dated, photographed with multispectral imaging and translated. The news was not announced publicly yet. Dunham wanted a careful rollout. He wanted academic papers first, then a controlled media leak. The monks insisted on anonymity and demanded that the exact location remain secret. The scholars respected that, citing the need to protect the site from looters and sensationalists. And then came the most surprising twist. As the translation work progressed, something shocking emerged from the codex's final, incomplete lines. The scribe had left a note referencing a twin disciple of Jesus, someone who had been entrusted with esoteric teachings not given to the other apostles. This twin disciple was named as Judas Thomas, long known to scholars as the disciple associated with the Gospel of Thomas. But here, it clearly identified this twin not merely as a spiritual twin, but as literally Jesus' identical twin brother, a notion previously unheard of in Orthodox traditions. This revelation was staggering. If the text was taken at face value, it suggested Jesus had a twin brother who received secret teachings, implying that Jesus' uniqueness was not in his physical lineage, but in the knowledge he carried and imparted. Some Gnostic texts speak cryptically about Jesus having a twin, often interpreted metaphorically. But this manuscript was more explicit. And the Lord said to Judas Thomas, "You, my twin and companion, shall carry forth that which I cannot speak openly. For the world is not ready, but you shall know all that I know, and what is mine is yours as well." This went beyond the typical Gnostic rhetoric. It was a direct challenge to Orthodox narratives. Jesus not as an only son, but as one of twins, his message equally accessible to another mortal figure. Scholars were in uproar. Some said it must be metaphorical. Others argued that the text, if authentic, changed everything we thought we knew. Dunham was thrilled at the sensational possibilities. I felt conflicted. Part of me knew this would cause controversy. Already word began to leak in certain academic circles. Rumors spread that the lost gospel claimed Jesus had a twin brother. Online forums and clandestine blog posts appeared. Dunham, ever the strategist, prepared a press conference with carefully chosen experts who would emphasize the need for measured interpretation. Before the press conference, I flew back to the monastery. I felt I owed the monks an explanation. Brother Samuel and his translator met me again. I told them what was about to happen. The world would learn of this text, and it might challenge believers, cause debates, inspire new understandings. Brother Samuel nodded solemnly. "The truth is what it is, regardless of how men react," the translator conveyed. "We only ask that you handle this with respect." I promised to do my best. As I left, I looked back at the ancient monastery cradled in the desert. This place had guarded a secret for centuries, perhaps millennia, only to have it revealed now. I thought about Jesus' words in the text. "Be not led astray by those who speak only of obedience and sacrifice. The true offering is understanding." If this text was authentic, then understanding would indeed be the rarest treasure here. The press conference in New York took place at a discreet venue. A panel of theologians, historians, and Coptic language experts presented the preliminary findings. They confirmed the age of the papyrus, the linguistic authenticity, and the remarkable parallels with known Nag Hammadi texts. Then they broached the twin passage. Gasps, murmurs, and frantic questions followed. Dunham observed from the wings, his expression smug. He had financed a bombshell. Now he was the patron of a discovery that would ripple through academic and religious communities. For my part, I was relieved that I hadn't simply delivered the codex into private hands, that I had helped ensure proper study and respectful disclosure. After the press conference, I walked out into the crisp autumn air. I'd solved the mystery, tracked the codex across continents, negotiated with monks and collectors. I'd found what seemed impossible, a nearly finished gospel hidden for centuries. And in doing so, I'd unearthed a truth that would challenge orthodox narratives and bring Gnostic ideas surging back into the public sphere. That night, before returning to my bookshop in New York, I opened a bottle of cheap wine and reread my photographs of the codex's pages on my laptop. One line I'd initially overlooked now struck me with great force. "All forms are but shadows cast by the inner light. Know this light, and you shall know the fullness of the Christ within." If that was the teaching Jesus wished to impart, Gnostic, mystical, transcending dogma, then perhaps this gospel's emergence was timely, in a world once again hungry for wisdom beneath institutional facades. I thought back to the start of my journey when I was a mere rare book dealer hoping for a lucrative commission. Now I stood on the threshold of history. The incomplete gospel might never be completed. It didn't need to be. Its fragmentary nature mirrored our own incomplete understanding of the past and the divine. But at least now, more pieces of the puzzle had been laid out for humanity to ponder, challenging us to seek truth within ourselves. Yes, everything had changed, and perhaps that was exactly what needed to happen.